Hey, everybody, it's Shad and Chris here with Of Impact, doing another podcast episode here today. It's just after the new year. Unfortunately, it's just us today. Alicia is out visiting family. But yeah, we're excited to dig in and pretty cool topic that we're going to go over today. Thank you guys for listening. And Chris, how's your New Year's?
Good, man. It was, rolling into 2024. Don't know what to expect here in the new year, but know it's gonna be big. Got big shoes to fill here on the podcast. Alicia is not here today to MC. Let's see if we can get this done well.
It'll be a good start to the year if we can get her approval on this episode. If it
All
gets
right.
deleted, then we're gonna have to go back to the drawing board. But I think we'll do all right. So a lot of you guys know that we run Of Impact, and we have every month we do a free kind of webinar meeting, and we get to talk to a lot of different business owners about just questions that they have, or maybe a topic they ran into that they want to deep dive. And one of the recurring themes that we constantly are getting asked about is business cash flow. It's a hot topic, but yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today. So excited. And yeah, we think quite a bit of value. We'll see if we can keep this around the hour mark.
Yeah, there's probably no more important topic, honestly, if you're a business owner than the cash flow of your company, how to improve it, and all of the factors that go into it.
It's true. I remember like with Live Infinitely, like it took me quite a while to understand the difference and understand fully cash flow versus your income, and like
Mhm.
where you feel like you're on top of the world, but then you're like, wait a second, where's all my money? I don't understand
Mhm.
this. Yeah.
Mhm.
So I think it is absolutely extremely important for business owners to understand. And yeah, I think let's dig in. Let's put some definitions to it. Can you explain the difference of cash flow to what maybe somebody's familiar with looking at, like a profit and loss statement or something like that?
Mhm. Right. And most financial software, if you're using it to take for bookkeeping and to keep records of your company, they'll have a P&L as a standard reporting package. And there's usually a statement of cash flow as well. But for the most part, the statement of cash flows isn't something that most small business owners focus on unless are a little bit larger. Sometimes if you do compilations for some reason, if you have shareholders or if you have banks that require you to produce financial statements, they'll look for that. The banks oftentimes will what they call spread financials, your P&L, and create those themselves. But most proprietors and entrepreneurs just really anchor on the balance sheet and the profit and loss, the income statement. But the income statement really isn't, depending on how the company's run, a proper representation of the cash flow generating power of the company. And in a lot of ways, it's not uncommon to see small business owners, medium sized, middle market companies managing their net income to minimize tax. So in a lot of ways, the income statement is a tax document that's used for the production of tax return information. Sometimes, obviously, like we were just saying, the banks need it if you're looking at loans or if you have loans and you have covenants or if you're looking to apply for loans. But there's several factors that go into producing cash flow that and accelerate cash flow and that aren't going to show up in your net income. And in many cases, your cash flow is going to be higher than your net income.
That makes sense. I think one thing that took me a while to comprehend and wrap my brain around is being a friend of the balance sheet. Like a lot of, depending on what size business and what your background and stuff is, a lot of people look at their profit and loss statement, but the balance sheet is like voodoo, or they don't really pay attention to it. And even a lot of the businesses we consult with are not, you ask them balance sheet questions, and then there's not a great understanding of that.
Yeah.
So I
Hmm.
think cash flow is something that kind of, to understand it fully, you need to understand both statements, and you need to understand the
That's
entire
right.
picture.
Yeah, that's
Um,
totally right.
it's something, I mean, would you say it's safe to say some of the business we've worked with, but would you say it's safe to say that even a profitable business could go bankrupt or find themselves in financial trouble if they mismanage their cash flow?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest issues because it's how the balance sheet now starts to interact with the P&L, with the income statement. And there's several factors related to that. I don't want to get accounting nerdy on the listening audience here, but a statement of cash flows, what it basically does is it starts from the net income and then starts to add and subtract from that to arrive at the actual cash addition or subtraction, the cash position of the company. And you're right. One of the hardest things is the timing of those cash flows that you need to run the company, both on the receivable side as you're collecting money from your customers and the timing of when that happens. And then also you have the other side of the balance sheet on the payable side when you owe people and how that flows through. So, yeah, net income, like you're stating there, isn't necessarily a safety measure depending on what your terms are.
That makes sense. So I know some of the times we've looked at businesses or talked about this before, and it's always pretty evident to me with cash flow, there is kind of certain businesses, every business is going to need to understand and know their cash flow, but you have an inventory heavy business, which will have
Hmm.
different pitfalls or things that they can manage cash flow with. Or then you have like more of a, just for lack of a better term, we'll call it a services business where they're not
Hmm.
necessarily inventory heavy, but they could still have cash flow, payroll and things like that. So they could still have the need to understand and adjust and properly manage their cash flow. So
Yeah.
I guess let's thinking about that. Let's think about an inventory based business, something like an e-commerce business, which
Hmm.
is buying products. Let's talk through that avenue first and go down that route. So knowing that, what are some common pitfalls or common mistakes that you see small businesses or medium sized businesses, some mistakes that you see them doing when trying to manage their cash flow?
Yeah, I think from a consumer product or from a product company where you're ordering product and you're having it delivered and you're trying to manage that and then you're ultimately selling it out. I think the biggest thing that I see, and it's really opportunity for these companies, is to be better about managing their suppliers. And what do I mean when I say managing their suppliers? A lot of times you're a taker of terms, but it's like a lot of other things in your personal life too. It's a point in time that you negotiate those things initially. And it's a good idea to see and continue to explore and test that to find out if you truly are working with the best party, the best counterparty on the supply side. And if you think you are from a quality standpoint, or maybe you've invested in tooling and such with that supplier, that maybe there are ways to improve terms over time. And obviously, you know a lot about that in the past. Do you remember how often you would revisit that on the terms side? And what would you say are good rules of thumb about when to check in on that and how to ask about it, even?
Honestly, it's funny that it's my education into cash flow kind of came in an interesting way. Like the first thing that I had to realize going back to the P&L statement was cash versus accrual accounting, like where cash being we would buy an order from the supplier or the manufacturer. And fresh out of high school, me was like, oh, drop that on the P&L. That's cost of
Hmm.
goods sold kind of deal. And so I had to learn to change that to, and we ran the business, of course, on accrual accounting,
Hmm.
where we were putting them in there, the cost in there as we sold the item. Then it was, okay, for us, it was like, we don't have any cash,
Hmm.
but we're profitable because every time the item left the warehouse, we were making money on it. The problem is there was a $500,000 of inventory still sitting at the warehouse that
Yeah.
like,
Hmm.
when we kind of pieced that together and really started to understand that was my next thing was like, I was not doing a good job of handling our inventory. We got too inventory heavy. So that's the first time I went back to the suppliers and said, hey, I don't remember what our original terms were, but we had to put something like 30% down to
Hmm.
even start an order in
Yeah.
Asia. And then I think 70% maybe when it was on the boat or something along those lines.
Hmm.
So right then that was our easiest opportunity. So we went back to the suppliers and said, hey, we want to reorder this stuff, but how can you help us out? We asked them to play bank for us for a while.
Sure. Definitely.
Um, the longer that we had that relationship with the supplier, the more that we would extend those terms and to the point where it was 20% down to start the order and then 60% maybe when it was on the boat and then 20% upon arrival. And then we
Yeah.
just kept extending that each order or two. I think it really depends on your relationship with the supplier, but each order or so, then we would try to extend that a little bit to the point where we were, before we sold the business, we were 45 days after the stuff was in our warehouse before we had to pay like maybe 40% of it. So it was like, that
Yeah.
was, and actually seeing that in action, that was like life changing for us, truthfully, because it gave us the ability to
Yeah.
scale and grow.
Absolutely. What you're talking about really is two things. It's the absolute dollar size of the payments, but then it's also the timing of them. And those two things have a huge impact on the company, especially if there is any measure of seasonality to the company, or if depending on how you've been growing, if there's additional expenses that are coming online, when other payments are due that are more fixed operating costs, like you mentioned, staffing or payroll, it makes all the difference when you have to make those payments, is what
Yeah,
we found out.
absolutely.
Yeah. Hmm.
Absolutely. And I think we approached it with to the suppliers as, hey, because as our orders grew, their orders were growing as well, right? They're doing better. So we
Hmm.
approached it as more of a relationship and say, hey, like we want to increase your business while increasing ours. They were very understanding. And it was funny because I don't know, maybe that year it was, at that point, it was 2.5 years. And I don't know why I just never thought to ask. And there was not even any pushback. It was,
Hmm.
we just asked and we had built somewhat of a relationship there already.
Yeah.
So then it was just, it wasn't like this big scary thing. Um, to then, as we grew more, it was very easy to get better and better terms
Mm.
with these people. I know some clients that we've dealt with, just of note with that, it's important to like kind of highlight sometimes suppliers will, in order to give you those terms, they'll try to get you to take more product than you would want
Right.
to, or,
Yeah.
and it can get you in a lot of trouble that way. Like you have to,
Hmm.
um, remember that they're lending you the money, so to say, but
Yeah.
it's still going to come due at some point. So you don't want to you don't want to let them write their own orders because you can
Yeah.
find yourself in trouble there.
Yeah, and so then that really brings into focus the necessity of having a real strong grip on your inventory turns, and how fast you're able to sell through stuff, and maybe where you're being more successful with certain products. It's not easy. That's what we're talking about, isn't easy, but it's critical to running the company, and then not just to running it and having staying power and developing this business for the long term, but also then to maximize and optimize that cash flow for the benefit of the constituents. You might have investors, and the cash flow to those investors isn't always the same. You can have debt investors involved in the company, many different types. We talked about banks a minute ago, but you can even just have family and friends. You could have other types of lenders. You could have equity investors, and the terms to them and the cash flow to those constituents just vary.
No, that makes sense. I think it is extremely important to understand like your inventory turns and to have a good handle on that, because it's like, and understand seasonality of your own product. I think
Yeah.
that is extremely important because the first Mother's Day that we were selling,
Mhm.
like it was like sales just skyrocketed. And this is our first few months in e-commerce. And I remember landing on a flight somewhere and like Alicia and I getting on the phone, or are we being scammed? But we didn't understand or realize how much seasonality the water bottle would have. It was a fantastic Mother's Day gift. So then,
Mhm.
of course, what do? We ordered too much product for the summer. So like understanding the seasonality of it, the inventory turns, and really monitoring that, I think super important. Another thing, tell me what your thoughts are on this, and it makes a lot of
Mhm.
sense. I heard it somewhere or read it, or I don't know, but it makes a lot of sense, but I never thought of it this way. Considering like your supplier is almost like a debt provider, right? Because you're
Yeah.
taking the order and it may not be as formal as a bank, but
Sure.
they're a debt provider. But not using debt like that, or to launch a new product. And to me, at first, it didn't. I was like, "How are you going to grow the business?" But then, as I thought about it more, it's essentially like talking about using your profits to grow, but not taking on debts on something that's not proven. Like you don't
Mm.
have
Mhm.
use debt to finance something that you can continue reordering. Maybe it's a consumable, something
Right.
like that.
Yeah.
But sometimes when you use debt to launch a new product, if that product flops, or
Yeah.
if you over order or something along those lines, where you can get yourself in a cash flow bind. What do you think about that concept?
Yeah, we talked about debt a couple times already. Debt is a cash flow from financing activities. There's three different types of cash flow. You have operating activities, you have capital activities, investing activities is what we call it. CapEx, different types of investing that you would do for your company. For a consumer products business, tooling might fall under that. And then you have financing activities, which would be debt. And so, yeah, it's great when you get the money in, you have something to do with it, but then you also have to pay it. And inventory is by definition an asset. And in a company, especially anywhere really, quite frankly, but especially for a company, profitable company, you want your assets producing return for you. You want a return on your assets. And so if you have inventory that really isn't producing return, this goes to your point, you're going to be financing something that has a negative return and that just doesn't work, or a very low return. You would very much want to finance inventory that turns quickly and that is more profitable if you can, so that you can cover the cost of the debt, the repayment of the debt, and you can continue to accelerate that cycle. So that's exactly right. You can get into a lot of trouble. But therein lies the risk, right? Every business has risk, and you want to grow, you're taking on risk. And for many business owners, you think about it, you saw this, and you've known many business owners over the past two, like I have, they're willing to bet on themselves 10 times out of 10, and the return that they can generate on their own company is much better than anywhere else that they can get. Call it the stock market, or potentially even in real estate or other asset classes, if it's a good company.
Right. Yeah. No, that's definitely an entrepreneur trait. It's put me in, coach. I got this. It doesn't
Exactly.
matter. Like down by 40 in the fourth down, and you're like, all right, there's still a chance. So,
You make it
um,
happen.
exactly. But I think that's probably, honestly, truthfully, side note, sidebar there. That's probably part of the reason that I love business and love talking to business owners, because definitely a unique personality that a business owner, somebody off running their own business has.
Well, and
Going back,
you
go-
see in my line of business where I'm in large part preparing companies to sell or taking them through the transaction process. I'm working with the guys and the entrepreneurs and women that have been successful. And in a lot of cases, we're preparing to just get the company into the best version of itself prior to taking it out. Now, in your line of work, you're working with companies that are still growing and they can still go through a lot of those ups and downs. And I guess there's a different perspective that you have when you're working with people that are still taking risks, trying to grow as much as they can.
That's true. And I don't know the exact number, but if we talk to 10 people, then you'll talk to one of those. There's a lot of businesses
Yeah.
out there that, one, fail, quite frankly, or two, just get burnt out before they even actually reach the golden goose or the golden egg to actually exit and go about starting something new or enjoying their life. I think going back to the inventory thing there, like you were talking about financing, if you have debt on the inventory and it's sitting in your warehouse, or 3PL for that matter, it took me a little bit to understand, because you're not seeing that loss per se on your P&L, because that item, you paid $2 for it. You're not thinking about, it sat there for 6 months. My interest
Hmm.
rate was such, and you're not really in your mind, you're not
Right.
adjusting your cost of that item up. So I
Mhm.
think we learned eventually, but I think it's something I see now where sometimes maybe the best decision, if you have a slow moving product or a dead product, where it makes sense to liquidate it, or just to
Yeah.
recapture some of the cash you got tied up in it.
No, that's a great point because there is, like with any asset, there's also tax treatments that you have to consider. And this goes back to now the income statement and how these two things and how they work together. If you believe that your opportunity with that capital freed up is better in a different type of product or in a different type of asset, you could be better off, like you said, liquidating it for even a loss, and you get a tax benefit for that loss, but you free up capital that you can then deploy and hopefully start to accelerate again. So that is a really good point.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Let me ask you this, because I find it's pretty easy to lie to yourself. If you're the only set of eyes on your balance sheet or P&L, it's pretty easy to say, oh, well, I'm going to sell that inventory next month, or like, how often when you dig in and do a full deep dive audit of a company, like how many times do you see stuff that really stands out to you on a balance sheet or a P&L that maybe the business owner or the operator has excused away or isn't really thinking about like that.
Yeah, the truth is, like, when I get in there, the way that I try to look at the situation, and in this case, the inventory, and the questions that I start to ask and the reports that I want to look at, or even just lay eyes on in the physical inventory sense at the warehouses, where's the slow moving stuff and why is it slow moving? And how long has it been there? And why is this condition present? And I'm looking at it that way because I need to take a thought about how's a buyer going to look at this? And we need to be realistic about it and understand that if this is a significant part of the business in terms of what used to be a historical growth engine for the company, but now it's starting to stretch in terms of the number of days that it takes to turn it, or even if there's obsolescence, depending on what type of product that it is. Those are all considerations, and the reason why is, like I said, you wanna be thinking about operating with the end in mind. I think in all cases, even if it's 8, 10 years from now, you still wanna be thinking about potentially, I think, selling the company, and you need to be always having that business and be the best version of itself that you can. So we look a lot at inventory turns, age of inventory, where that's coming from, why those conditions exist. Is it, and then how to rectify the situation depending on what time frame we're working within.
That makes sense. So I think we went through that a little bit, but essentially the buyer, if you're selling your company, the buyer might not want that inventory. But if it's
Yeah,
very clear it's sitting there for a while, like at some point you're going to take the loss on it, free up the capital, redeploy it where it is working for your business. And we every mistake you can make in business at some point, I feel like we've done it, but we had to do that. And then when you like really cumulatively look at it, and then you can say, wow, yeah, I'm making up numbers here. We took a $2 per loss or loss per item on that first one, but that capital, we were able to reinvest it in new colors of what was working, and it turned out to be a net profit when it was all said and done. There was just a little speed bump
yeah,
along the way. But okay, so that's inventory kind of businesses, and to summarize is one of your biggest things pitfalls is your inventory control. One of
mhm,
your levers that you have, so to say, to really improve on that is going to your supplier and working
yeah,
with them. That can
yeah,
go for tooling, that can go for like if it's with that supplier, that can be
definitely.
renegotiated. I know one thing that we had done too is there was some tooling for items, and
Mhm,
we asked them for essentially a cost per unit increase. They wanted us to shell out, I don't know how many thousands of dollars, $30,000 it was for the tooling.
okay,
But we said, let's take it up a quarter per unit until we pay you back 35,000.
got it.
It bought us a year and a half. And at the end of the day, we didn't even sell that many of the items. So like it
Yeah,
was actually cheaper, but
mhm.
it was a negotiation, and we found that to be helpful. But
Well,
what
and from that
good.
perspective too, Shad, we're talking about consumer products, businesses. There's also other types of companies out there that operate in an inventory management capacity, more in the commercial sense too. And I have clients presently that are like that. And what we're talking about right now is, remember, it's an asset. So if you've got a stale inventory or slow moving stuff, it's also possible that it's also not bad. It's just that it's slow moving. And if it's slow moving, what else can you do? And so a couple things that we've been looking at is, what's the cost of your storage in your primary location? The cost for that, maybe there's ways to offset that, or there's more economical ways to handle that if you were to relocate it to a cheaper option for some in some way. And then there are even some products that I'm thinking of for this one client that we've been having discussions about leasing them. So actually converting them into a different type of asset for a period of time. And you can't do that with water bottles or with other types of consumer products or electronics necessarily, but with commercial products, there is that opportunity. And and so you could see an income come from that leasing revenue, come from that product over time. And it also allows you to do something with that product, which is depreciate the asset if you convert it. And there's certain accounting treatments, but what we talk about the difference between income statement and cash flow. If you can depreciate something, you can take a non cash charge against it on the income statement, and that'll save you on the taxes, and that'll allow you to have a greater true cash flow from the business.
No, that's a good idea. That makes sense. It's almost equivalent of if you can't sell your house, you turn it into a
That's it.
rental kind of deal and
Exactly.
you make some cash along the way and
Mhm.
then sell it at some point and it can really work out. It's funny because in the real estate investing world, which we spend a little bit of time there, you hear a lot of people talking cash flow, cash flow, cash flow. And
Mhm.
then you ask them like, what do you mean by that? And it's, they just heard somebody else say cash flow. So then they
Yeah.
want to, but it's really interesting to understand it and how it applies so differently. Like there's an inventory business, but on the commercial side where you can handle it in a completely different way, a creative solution, and it actually probably long-term really benefit that business.
Mhm. Mhm.
With the second thing about the inventory business, what are some other ways or what are other ways to improve cash flow or better debt terms? Or what is something that maybe some of the listeners aren't familiar with on ways that they can generate cash flow or improve?
And I think maybe what you're saying is, if I understand it right, is if you have inventory as a significant piece of your company, you have significant outgoing outflows to your supplier, and you have to time those properly. On the other side, you also have receivables and you have payments coming to you. And there are ways that you can manage the inflows of your cash to better optimize the timing of those so that you're not in a pickle. That was what you were saying earlier, where you could still be profitable in the end, but you could go find yourself in a pinch along the way. And some of the ways that obviously we see companies operating and utilizing debt for that in a smart way, lines of credit are good for that purpose, short term lines of credit to get you through seasonality, to get you through stretches based on other terms like we're talking about. Another idea that I work with my clients on is evaluating if factoring is an option to where you have inflows coming in and do you want the ability to get an advance on that effectively and have somebody pay you for those and then collect on them. And then there's different types of factoring that you can enter into with companies where they'll advance you that money sooner. And so there's cost benefit to all these things. And there's other ones we can talk about too. So working with someone who really understands historically what that looks like can be helpful to you so that you don't have to take the time to go through that learning process of understanding what do rates look like now, what do terms look like, where can you get it, what's the best lender, how do I find that, what are the other options, who does offer factoring, what's the difference between recourse and non-recourse factoring, and then based on the time frame that you're working with, what is the true cost to you?
Yeah. Let's dig into a couple of those. 'Cause I think
Yeah, sure.
there's a lot. I think there's a lot of really good stuff right there that you just said. Let's go back to the line of credit. So one thing I know probably every single person listening to this, if they're in e-commerce, you've seen the Shopify Capital or
Mhm.
some version of I don't, for lack of better terms, a payday loan.
Yeah.
I know we've used those because we had to. And I didn't really understand some of the debt
Mhm.
or line of credits that were available to small business.
Mhm.
But if you do the math on those with a daily repayment, like your effective interest rate is like astronomical. Like it
Mhm.
is probably safe to say not a good suggestion unless like you have nothing else left to
Yeah.
do.
Mhm.
What would be outside of that, what would when if you were looking at a business, what would you recommend to call or check into when it line of credit or loan wise?
The one that I see used the most is the SBA, Small Business Administration loans that are offered and distributed through and underwritten through the community and the national banks. And there's pros and cons to everything. Like you were saying, the one that you were giving right there, thinking about, is very expensive. And in comparison to that, the SBA small business debt is not. It can be one of the most economical forms of debt available. And also the terms are quite good because you have the federal government through the SBA guaranteeing somewhere between 75 and 85% of the principal value so that the bank can feel comfortable loaning that money. So that's one that I see tapped a lot. And if you're not talking about a real estate loan, lines of credit are usually very easy to get. The rate that you would pay is often a function of how much you're requesting to borrow. So the rate that you pay will go down the more that you are looking to borrow. And right now, that range it's indexed to the prime rate at those banks, and the spread on that is generally somewhere between 2.5 and maybe even 4% based on how much you're looking to borrow. So, and it's something in the maybe $1 million range, a few 100,000 to $1 million range might be something like prime, which is currently 8.5 plus 3. So you might be looking at 11.5% for a small business line of credit.
And that's far cheaper than a Shopify Capital, Amazon
Yeah.
loan, something like that.
Yeah.
Especially because with the SBA program, which I feel like there's a lot of people that do utilize it, but then there's a lot of people that it's new or maybe you've never heard of it. But those are monthly repayments versus like a Shopify Capital, for example, you're doing a daily repayment. So if you think about it,
Mm-hmm.
like your first payment, they lent you money for one day and you're paying
Yeah.
9% back on it or something along those lines.
Hmm.
So for the SBA, I think, I know we've talked about buying, selling businesses and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's the same program. You can use loans or they have programs to
Yeah.
buy businesses as well, right?
Yep. There's a section in the code that was written, and it's just a technical term. It's called a 7A loan or line of credit. And those relate to businesses that are predominantly cash flow businesses. They're not secured by real estate. There can be additional security that the bank would look to attach to or collateral, maybe the machinery, where there's different types of accounts. Obviously, they would take a blanket lien on the company. One of the downsides to bank finance debt is that oftentimes they'll require a personal guarantee. So there are offsets in the analysis, but the 7A loan program is one of the best out there, and in all 50 states. And there's different types of lenders that you can work with, but it's widely available. The federal government's looking to stimulate the economy in the small and mid-sized business market in the United States. And those lines of credit, if you just stick with lines of credit, you were talking about an acquisition loan, but if you just stick with the lines of credit as ways to finance and to improve your cash flow of your company, generally you can get something in the order of 100 to $250,000 pretty easily at a bank. And what's often not known is that if you do international trade, export lines of credit can be upwards of $600,000 in principal amount
Oh, wow. It's the big difference. I didn't even know about that one or the
availability.
export
Yeah.
one.
Mhm.
With an SBA loan, you can still use, depending on which bank you're at, you can get that loan through your current bank, right? Like, how do you go about getting, without not every piece of
Yeah.
paperwork required, where would somebody actually apply for this loan or get more information on it? Or I keep saying loan, but line of credit.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes businesses already have established bank relationships. I think sometimes those bank relationships are important to entrepreneurs. It just depends on the type of company you have and what your business needs are. The banks that are in your community, if that's something you care about, having a relationship with a community banker, about having someone, they'll look to maintain that relationship. They want to grow it over time. They want to make sure that they increase their share of business with you. Things it transcends just beyond savings and checking accounts. They're looking to get credit cards potentially with the business, and now if we're talking about lines of credit, I would say you would start with business with banks in your community, ones that are local to you. That's a depository relationship usually is part of that. And the more business you do with them can often improve the terms that a bank's willing to offer you, or in many different ways when it comes to extending debt. So that would be a community-based lender. And the national lenders are doing this too. Your Wells Fargo's and your Bank of America's and your Chase, JP Morgan, they do all of this also. It's just that your experience is going to be very different. And one last point on that is that if you are interested in SBA debt, working with what's known as a preferred lender is often advantageous to you as a borrower because it can shorten time frames and it can give you a lot more visibility into the process because the bank itself has the authority to grant those loans without having to interface with the representatives in the government.
I gotcha. I mean, to summarize, it's where the bank's the one who is your bank, maybe you're using already, or a national or a local bank. They're the ones who you're going to actually you communicate with on the loan, but why it's so lucrative is it's backed by the SBA program is backed by the federal government. So
Mhm.
they're backing that, but I would still go potentially to Chase, my banker at Chase, and talk to him about getting an SBA loan.
That's right.
But that makes sense. And the other one, I think, in terms of debt and stuff like that, is something which I think is even credit cards, which you
Mm.
think about a high interest rate, but if you're able to pay that credit card off every month, it's
Yeah.
in a way that's a 30-day or 60, depending on your credit card terms. It's an interest-free loan. Essentially, you can use
Right.
that for 30 days as long as you're paying it off. And I know there's some services out there that I think plastic is one, or plastique or something along that line, where you can actually use your credit card to mail a check to somebody.
Oh, wow.
So
Okay.
they don't even have to. There's a little bit of a fee associated with
Yeah.
that, but when you're considering looking at all your options and simplicity for use, because maybe it's a little depending on the amount and how much, it could be a couple percent for 30 days is essentially what you're at there.
And you see a lot of different types of clients, and you obviously, from firsthand experience, helping them grow their companies, and then you had your experience with your own. And I think one of the things that your clients see is that you often like the value proposition to them is that you run the company for them if that's what you're doing on an engagement as though it is your own. And what types of tactics did you use or what benefits did you see? Maybe did you say you were running a lot through your credit cards? You were earning income off of that. I guess talk about that a little bit more because I don't know that it seems pretty obvious, right? But I don't know that it necessarily is.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, it's the cashback thing. So we ran, I don't know, 70 to $100,000 a month in advertising just on Facebook alone. And that was on a Chase cashback card. Like, we could get terms with Facebook 30 days or whatever, but
Hmm.
yeah, 2% cash back on that every single month. Yeah, we drastically, I mean, that you can generate quite a bit of income. At one point, I don't have the number now, but we figured out how many mortgage payments we made just off the cash back of our
Oh
card,
yeah.
because we use that card for Facebook and Google and Amazon, any advertising, which in e-commerce was our biggest expense. That
Hmm.
was our biggest outlay of capital besides inventory. So yeah, we absolutely utilize that. And every so often you go back and shop the market and look at the cards. And if you spend $10,000 in the first 90 days, maybe you get $1,000 cashback bonus. So
Hmm.
within reason, you're looking at that stuff because depending on how big your business is,
Yeah.
$1,000 in your pocket just by typing different numbers in onto your screen, a new credit card number, it's worth it.
Yeah.
And we already had our mortgage at that point. So it's not like we tried to trash our credit score, but we weren't going to have a major credit pull like a mortgage anytime soon that they were going to ask that about. But yeah, we absolutely utilize that credit cards to their fullest. And, we've went years in business and never paid interest. You just make sure you pay them off at
Yeah.
and it's like the old adage, you spend responsibly. We didn't just buy new computers, buy everything on a credit card just to buy it. But
Hmm.
if it's expenses you are frequently using for your business. Another one was shipping, right? Because we ran our own warehouse. So all of our shipping was put on credit card.
Okay.
And then that generated quite a bit of cash every year for us. That was our like surprise money or whatever.
Yeah.
But the
Right.
other thing, we talked about it earlier, but I forgot about it. But with your inventory, your storage valuation. So when we dig into a company, if we do a full takeover or just a full dig on the consulting side, it's storage fees, like especially a company that has Amazon or a 3PL,
Yeah.
you really have to understand your storage fees because inventory just sitting there at Amazon, for example, especially during the holiday time frame, that gets extremely expensive.
Huh.
So,
Yeah.
in case you guys are hearing that, there's Remy apparently figuring out that I'm not with him.
The
So
dog. Yeah.
yeah, the dog. Everybody knows the Remy, but he's not happy that we didn't invite him to this episode. But yeah, is understanding inventory. So to sum that up, like we we found that 3 months of Amazon storage fees paid for our entire warehouse for the year. So that's why we said, okay, let's open our own warehouse. And not everybody wants to do that, but just the fact you need to be cognizant of that sort of thing because
Yeah.
Amazon isn't extremely transparent with what they're charging you, or some 3PLs aren't extremely transparent. the information's available, but they don't put it on a big red flag and say, hey, look what we charged you this, just understanding of that.
Yeah, businesses that move product aren't in the storage business, they're in the moving business, but it's a necessity that you have to, optimize, and it definitely impacts your cash flow. And
Exactly.
like you're saying is that as you grow and depending on how it turns, which is what we were talking about earlier, you may need to make use of several different types of storage or mediums, intermediate stopping points.
Exactly. Cause it seems like the closer you get to that final mile, the higher per square foot that you're paying. Yeah, absolutely. Understanding that, or even just taking an honest look at this stuff and saying, hey, yeah, we might take a loss to liquidate this stuff or to get rid of it. But how much are you actually losing in storage fees because of it?
Mhm.
Right? Like to considering all of that. But
Is there something that you would tell the listeners, knowing from personal experience, and I have some experience too, trying to consult with these parties, of what do you want to be evaluating and who do you reach out to and like where do you start? You're like, you got a warehouse, and you know how much you spend for that warehouse. Maybe it's a triple net lease and you're paying something per foot. But you're also realizing that you're going to be growing and you need to be considering other ways to reduce cost if you can while you grow. What are some of the things that you would tell people to start thinking about?
I'm biased, right? Because we run a consulting agency now, but genuinely, I think a quality set of second eyes on stuff is beyond helpful for some people because there's people that we've worked with that really do try to be frugal and diligent on looking at this stuff. But if it's something that they've
Hmm.
looked at so many times, they think, oh, there's no way to improve that. So
Yeah.
sometimes it is bringing
Hmm.
a fresh set of eyes in and to look at things differently, or even just be a question being asked that nobody's asked them before. Like sometimes it's just looking, there was a client that we had that we switched the way they ship the stuff from UPS ground to the UPS ground saver or got renegotiated rates with them. And it's six figures a year.
Of
That's it. And
savings.
all of
Hmm.
savings. And it's just, they didn't even know that new service came out, or they didn't think to go back to renegotiate. But sometimes it's just a fresh set of eyes. That's that's a double edged sword though, because not everybody is created equally. So you just got to make sure that you trust whoever you're getting
That's
into your
true.
business.
Yeah, that's
Like
true.
and yeah, and I think that's where Alicia and I were good. But it was funny with inventory. Like she didn't want to know the numbers of inventory we had or deal with that. So it was hard to necessarily talk about that sometimes just because it's stressful, right? If you're ordering these massive amounts of inventory. But I think just actually sitting down and talking to it, if you have a business partner or like us,
Hmm.
business and personal, where we talked through it and made sure that we both understood it. And sometimes just her asking a question to me and making me explain it to her
Yeah.
made me think about it differently, better understand it, or change my way of thinking. So just being
Right.
asked the question sometimes
Yeah.
is what it takes.
And to take it a step further, we're talking about different ways that you can make more. We're talking about cash flow. So you can either make more. We've talked about accelerating sales, improving margin on product, maybe by the quantities that you're ordering. There's other things that you can do to improve the timing of the cash flow. You can renegotiate terms in other ways with shipping and whatnot. You can even take it so far as what you guys did, just more of a do it yourself. And you saved a lot, but you also worked hard, right? There's that aspect to it. So you can make more. You talked about credit card points adding to that, but you can also spend less. There's other ways that you can try to spend less, improving cash flow. And then another way, I think that often it goes back to supplier terms, but you can also do this in other ways, is to look at the different ways that you have contracts with your clients or your customers to try and just improve the terms of your own business and see where there are ways that you can accelerate payment or change the terms in your favor.
And you're talking specifically there about the money. We've talked about debt, and that's at the money going out of the business. You're talking about more efficiently bringing the money into your business, or looking at your own contracts, which it was something I heard you say earlier, which I definitely want to dig into because I venture to guess a lot of people probably never even heard of it, but was the factoring, invoice factoring.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and how that can benefit and your experience with that?
Yeah. These are done by companies. Well, factoring is just a way of looking at your what's coming into the company or what's promised to come into the company over a certain period of time. And companies out there, banks included, they'll do this too. It's different types of what they call asset-based lending. But in some cases, factoring companies are different than banks in that they'll advance you the money at a certain rate relative to the size of the receivables or the money that you expect to come in a one. And so there are companies out there that will look at the size and terms of your receivables, and based on the age of those receivables, they'll be willing to advance a certain percentage of those to you in the form of cash payment. And obviously, the difference between what they advance and 100% is what it costs you. Just as a simple example, if you have receivables that are less than 45 days and you have a company that's willing to advance 95% of that, they would be, if you have $100,000 of that, they would give you 95,000 up front. And there's two different types of businesses that you can work with in factoring. There's ones that offer no recourse, which means that if ultimately the customers that you're working with end up not paying, it falls back to them and it's their liability. So they're the ones that collect and work to get the payments from the customers. And then there's recourse debt, which means if after a certain period of time they don't receive payment like as agreed, they'll put it back on you, and then it becomes a true up that has to occur between you and the factoring company.
That makes sense. So they're essentially advancing the payment, and then you can use that cash inside of your business. And
Yep.
that's definitely, I know for service businesses, and I guess it probably depends on the quality of client and how big and to what these companies will do. If you're working with if your invoice is to a big blue chip company, like there are probably different rates on factoring than if it
Yep.
was a
Yep.
Henry's lawnmower shop down the street kind of deal.
Yeah, it's all the cost is all relative to risk.
That
And
makes sense.
like you were saying, the counterparty risk, it makes a big difference.
That makes complete sense. With that, I guess when I know you work with a lot of different brands, either selling or would you call it like installed CFO services deal, something like
Mhm.
that?
Yeah.
Is that something that you like in a larger company, that's something you look into or help them determine if they're trying to advance cash, what that would be as far as is it best to do a line of credit, factoring? If the goal is to get the cash faster,
Yeah.
what all different things are you going to weigh there to determine what's okay? The smartest decision would be to factor or take a line of credit, or what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's really the speed that you're converting cash from into dollars that you can spend is the speed that occurs. A lot of times if there's product involved, it's just looking at the true inventory and the cash conversion cycle that goes there. But one thing that I do as part of the exit planning and the strategic business development engagements that I do is legal contracts and looking at available options that are already either being used and how we can improve those, or improve them in an absolute sense with what counterparty they're already using, or in comparison to others that maybe they're not aware of, or different types. And what are the things that go into that? Obviously, the cost is one. If going back to our example, if we're looking at spending effectively $5,000 to receive that money, that 95, you would want to compare that to other sources of capital and what the cost would be for that over time. And then also make sure that you're looking at it on a tax affected basis so that you're really comparing apples to apples. And depending on what the timing of the needs are, you'll be able to make a more informed decision. And those are things that I help with almost on every engagement where we're doing outsourced CFO work.
That makes sense. That makes complete sense. It really depends on how long that business is going to need that money for, or
Mhm.
when they can pay it back, or that makes a ton of sense. I think a couple other things. I know we're running, I guess we're approaching an hour here now, but I love it. Stuff I can sit here and talk about it all day. But
Mhm.
anywho, for an inventory business, you think about giving a discount. You run a sale, you give a discount. Essentially, what you're trying to do is you're lowering your margin, but you're trying to bring that money in earlier. You're trying to sell the stuff, and in a way, you're advancing cash flow. But
Right.
in a non-inventory business,
Mhm.
um, what else could you do? If you got outstanding invoices, without necessarily going to a line of credit or factoring? Is there any other ways that you could bring that forward?
Yeah, like you said, there's lots of different types of companies and even ones that do have some form of inventory needed. You think about companies that do maintenance on auto or on other types of equipment, they need to have a certain amount of stock on hand, but their primary business is service. Or you think about landscapers. Landscapers actually and other types of maintenance companies are a good example of what I like to do when I go in and evaluate companies is think about ways that you can smooth out the cash flow and create what I call certainty about the timing and the amount of it. And instead of thinking in terms of transactional in a transactional sense, thinking more in terms of a contractual sense so that what you with landscapers, especially like in a residential or even commercial real estate setting, is they look to not just mow lawns and get paid for by lawn, but they look to do it and integrate additional services in there and then set that up so that it's a multi-month or a multi-year type of scenario and you have a customer that's paying for that monthly, even during months when there's less to do, but they understand that they're willing to do that. The customer's willing to do that to secure a spot on the roster effectively for the landscaper. And then they integrate additional services along the way. But that's a way to use a contract if you're a business owner to create more certainty about the cash flow to extend the life cycle of that customer and in doing that, from an investment standpoint, it creates more certainty, less risk, and those things equate into a higher valuation in the end.
That makes sense. You're smoothing seasonality by a little bit less. You're getting paid a little bit less per lawn cuts in July, but then in
Right.
December. But yeah, and it's funny you said it's exactly how our lawn care contractor or our landscapers at our house are. It's like we pay them the same all year, and they come around like once in December, but it smooths out for them, and they know for when they're buying equipment and all that stuff, they know that hey, this house is good for the years, kind of deal.
Mm.
Interesting too, you said about the auto repair because my dad actually had a auto repair garage for years growing up.
Oh, really?
And yes, that's actually where I learned a lot of most of my mechanical background and the stuff,
Okay.
the gearhead that I turned out to be. Yeah, definitely 100% driven from dad. But understanding the stuff I do about business now, I can look back at that and be like, we had
Yeah.
to shell out as a shop if a car came in and needed a transmission or an engine or an expensive part, like right outside of an oil filter concept. We had to shell that money out and maybe we had terms with like Jasper Transmission where we could pay them 14 days later or 20
Yeah.
days later or whatever it is. But then the customer, like depending small town, depending on whether you would let that car leave or not, that's a whole different conversation. But at the end of the day, even if we still have their car and it's sitting in our parking lot,
Mhm.
we still need to pay Jasper and the customer maybe hasn't paid
Right.
us yet.
Yeah.
So you can, I don't know if you call that milestone payments or splitting that where it would have been a lot smoother for that operation
Okay.
to um, make the customer pay up front for the parts or
Mhm.
get your client to essentially pay up front for the parts and
Yeah.
then extend terms on service or something along those lines.
Sure. Yeah. And there's one client in particular that I'm working with, and in order to smooth out and improve the cash flow profile of the company, it necessitated a pretty good analysis of making an investment to do that. And so we looked at hiring a business development person for the company that would then be tasked with going out and contractualizing a lot of that work that was already being done. And so putting in place contracts that now create dependable revenue streams. And it allows you to take control of your business in a lot different way than you were before, where you're sitting back waiting for business to come to you and you're like constantly trying to schedule it and making it's like keeping all the plates spinning. You're now able to go out and set terms for your business and you can set the calendar for your business and you can put in place how that's going to play out over the next 3 years or 4 years or five. And so the more that you can do with that, it also helps now. You can imagine where hiring decisions used to be a fire drill by the seat of your pants. Hey, we're growing, and you don't know how to assess that risk because you're taking on a fixed cost now. You have another contract that you're having fixed income versus fixed cost, and it makes a lot more sense.
That makes, yeah. So it's essentially a little bit of upfront expense or with that person's salary or payment, but
Right.
then what you're contractualizing in the long term. And I know we were this way, and there's a
Mhm.
lot of businesses that they don't want to do that stuff. They just want to
Mhm.
turn the wrenches or run the ads. Or they don't want to deal with, but they don't want to deal with contracts necessarily. But essentially, like you're saying, you bring somebody on, that's what they do. And I know we were guilty of that where we like, depending on what time of the day, it's which hat am I putting them on? Am I a marketer? Luckily there was no door kicking in debt collecting for water bottles,
Yeah.
but yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Cool. I think that was a lot. I think we talked in like, eh, hopefully understanding the difference between cash flow and net income and how those live differently,
Mm.
some of the pitfalls of cash flow, and then really some ways that they can improve depending on what style business. I
Yeah.
think no matter what business you have, there's ways that you can likely improve it, whether that's having somebody look at it and getting
Mhm.
creative, or it could just be renegotiating terms with your supplier. There's
Mhm.
squeaky wheel gets the oil kind of concept.
Uh-huh.
Like
Yeah.
you dig into it and there's some way that you can likely improve on it.
Yeah, it's legal contracts aren't just for attorneys, and I think that the CFO function, if you will, or the financial function really needs to accept that because you're dealing with all kinds of contracts. You're dealing with your own potentially, depending on what type of business you run. You're dealing with landlords, you're dealing with leases, and we were talking about whether it's warehousing space or other types of office space, and then yeah, if you have suppliers and the a lot of stuff is boilerplate depending on the type and size of your company, but you shouldn't just assume it. And I think working with a professional who can help you and who's seen the landscape can point you in the right direction and really help to strategically think about how to make these improvements and where they can be made.
No, that makes a ton of sense. I'm like, don't want to sign up for more than we or bite off more than we can chew here, but I'm like, I feel like we should do a course on cash flow. We should really put together something that is this hour and a half episode or hour, whatever it was
Sure.
now, is beneficial. But I feel like we should set up a course someday.
Well, if you're a bean counter, if you like accounting and you get into the nitty gritty and you understand how a statement of cash flow is built up, it really helps with the knowledge of what all of those levers are to, and so when you're looking at the statement of cash flows, even for the listeners now, I mean, if you just go on line and start doing some digging and searching to just educate yourself around the components of the statement of cash flows and like the pieces that I was talking about, the operating cash flows, the investing cash flows, and the financing cash flows, each one of those segments, there's tons of ways that you can pull levers and make changes and think about how that will affect your company. It's a great exercise in making yourself a better operator.
Yeah, we'll have to see. Maybe that we can even put together a statement of cash flow, and
Yep.
with possibly with the every month where we're doing the free group coaching call, the hour call, maybe we could even have that on
Definitely.
there. Yeah, that would be cool. Spitball on it. I'll text Alicia and tell her that's the next topic and see what she says. She get her approval. But
If
yeah,
any
so
if anything, even just on this call was interesting or maybe even just unclear, wants to dive in further or even just get clarification, always happy to spend a little time there just to do that.
awesome. No, that sounds good. I'm sure people reach out. So it's just ofimpact.com or impactadvisors.com. They link to each other. Yeah, I guess you can get in touch that way. And if you're on either one of the email lists, you'll get invited to
Yeah.
the monthly free webinar, which or we call it a webinar or group coaching, but it's essentially just happy hour, sitting down and informal and answering questions. It's actually pretty fun. Remy made
Yeah.
an appearance there last time. I'm sure he'll be back. I'm surprised he's not here already. So but yeah,
Okay.
maybe we can plan on that or putting together a course and deep dive in this. But yeah, I
Sure.
think it was very beneficial. I think it'd probably open some people's eyes or even get them to start thinking about stuff differently after today's episode. So
Yep, yep.
cool. Any last thoughts or any last suggestions before we head out?
No, the I think the biggest thing you can do is just like I was saying, just try to put in the work just to understand that there are always things to be thinking about more than just pick your head up out of the weeds of the operations of the company and to think it strategically about how to make some of these improvements. You might be very surprised at the things you'll find. And as always, we're willing to help have those discussions and identify those opportunities.
Awesome. Well, sounds good. But thanks for joining us today. And yeah, we'll see you guys all on the next episode. Thanks, Chris.
All right, man. Good talking to you,
All right.
Shad.
You too. We'll see you.
Bye.